You ever had a family argument so wild you ended up in the ER and then the bank? Because let me tell you, I never thought I'd be the kind of person with that story to tell, but here we are. It all started on one of those Sundays that had every sign of being perfectly normal. The kind of day where the smell of roasted potatoes and gravy fills the air, where laughter drifts in from the living room as the grandkids chase each other around, and where the comforting chaos of family life feels like home. Sunday dinners at our house were sacred. Loud, messy, and full of warmth, they were the highlight of my week. Linda, my wife, ran the show like a five-star general in an apron, barking orders, tasting sauces, and keeping everyone in line while making sure the roast didn't turn into charcoal. The kids joked that she could manage a restaurant and a daycare at the same time, and honestly, they weren't wrong. I'd usually play the role of referee, storyteller, and designated gravy pourer. It was a system that worked, a beautiful kind of chaos. That evening was no different, or so I thought. The table was set, plates piled high with mashed potatoes, green beans, and Linda's famous meatloaf. The one everyone swore was better than their own moms. The grandkids were busy making trade deals like tiny Wall Street brokers. 2 rolls for 1 extra scoop of potatoes, 3 for a slice of pie. Laughter filled the room, spoons clinked against plates, and for a moment, everything was perfect. Then Jessica, my daughter-in-law, cleared her throat. Now, if you know Jessica, you know she's not exactly the subtle type. When she wants your attention, she gets it. No half measures. She's the kind of woman who could sell sunscreen in a snowstorm, all charm and confidence, and when she believes in something, she goes all in. This time, instead of speaking softly, she made her entrance with a thud. A stack of glossy house brochures landed right in the middle of the dinner table, nearly toppling the gravy boat. "Dad, we found the one," she announced, her voice bright and filled with excitement. She started fanning out the brochures like a Vegas dealer, each one showing a house more impressive than the last. Big windows, modern kitchens, manicured lawns, the kind of places you see in commercials where everyone's smiling and drinking lemonade on the porch. Mike, my son, sat next to her, grinning from ear to ear. He looked like a man who'd just hit the jackpot, like all his dreams were about to come true. I remember watching him for a second, thinking maybe they had actually stumbled into some miracle, won a lottery, inherited a fortune, something like that. Because that's how hopeful he looked, how certain. But as any parent knows, the real world has a habit of showing up uninvited. And sure enough, before I could even process the excitement, Jessica dropped the line that would change the whole evening. "We just need you to co-sign the loan." She said it as casually as if she were asking me to pass the salt. The sound of her words hit me harder than I expected. The room went dead quiet, except for the faint sound of my youngest grandson slurping juice through his straw, completely unaware that the adults at the table were about to enter dangerous territory. Now don't get me wrong, I love my family. I'd walk through fire for any of them. But I've lived long enough and seen enough to know that co-signing a loan is the kind of favor that can come back to haunt you. It sounds simple, it sounds generous, but underneath that gesture is a world of risk. I'd heard too many stories about families torn apart because someone couldn't make the payments, because one signature turned into a lifetime of resentment. I could already picture it. Late-night calls from the bank, my credit score nosediving, my savings evaporating, all because I wanted to help. I didn't want to be the villain in that story, so I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and said as gently as I could, "I'm sorry, guys, but I don't think it's a good idea for me to co-sign. You know how these things can go." I tried to make my voice calm, even sympathetic, but the air shifted instantly. You could feel it. Jessica's smile faltered. Mike's expression fell from excitement to disbelief in an instant. The energy around the table turned heavy. It was like I just told them Christmas was canceled and their puppy ran away on the same day. "Dad, come on," Mike said, his voice rising, hands gesturing wildly as bits of mashed potato flew from his fork. "We've got everything lined up. We just need your signature. It's not like we're going to default or anything." He looked desperate, maybe even offended that I didn't trust him. But this wasn't about trust, it was about reality. "It's not about you," I said, trying to stay steady. "It's about the risk. I've worked too hard to get where I am, and I can't jeopardize that. I'm sorry." The silence that followed was thick, the kind that settles in your bones. Jessica looked down at her plate, jaw tight, her fork digging into her meatloaf like it had personally betrayed her. Mike's frustration was written all over his face. Then, in one of those absurd, blink-and-you-miss-it moments that define family stories forever, chaos struck. Mike threw his hands up, frustration bubbling over. His elbow clipped the edge of the table, sending a rogue meatball rolling across the tablecloth like a tiny cannonball. He instinctively lunged to catch it, because heaven forbid we waste Linda's perfect meatballs. In his scramble, his arm swung wide and collided with mine. There was a sharp, horrifying crack, and for a moment time froze. I stared down, not quite believing what I was seeing. My finger was bent at an angle no finger should ever bend. It didn't even look real. The grandkids went silent, eyes wide as saucers, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Even Linda stopped mid-step, her face going pale. The pain hadn't even fully hit yet, but my mind was already spinning. Was this real? Was I actually sitting at my own dinner table, covered in mashed potatoes, with my son standing over me and my finger looking like something out of a horror movie? And then the pain came. Hot, sharp, blinding. It shot up my arm so fast my eyes watered. Linda was by my side in an instant, wrapping a dish towel around my hand, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, are you okay?" "Mike, what did you do?" Mike's face went white. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Oh man." He couldn't even finish his sentence. Jessica grabbed her phone, frantically typing. "What to do when you break a finger at dinner?" she muttered. "Oh, come on, there's got to be something." The grandkids, bless their curious little hearts, were fascinated. "Does it hurt, Grandpa? Can I see it? Are you going to get a robot finger now?" I wanted to laugh and cry all at once. Linda hustled me toward the car, insisting we go to urgent care immediately. I sat there in the passenger seat, my finger throbbing, mashed potatoes still smeared on my shirt, thinking, is this really my life right now? The absurdity of it all hit me in waves. The pain, the chaos, the broken finger, all because I wouldn't sign one piece of paper. As the lights of the ER flickered overhead and Linda filled out forms, I couldn't help but chuckle through the pain. Life had a strange sense of humor, didn't it? You try to protect your family, make the smart choice, avoid unnecessary risks, and somehow you end up injured anyway. The doctor confirmed what we already knew. "It's broken," he said matter-of-factly as he said it and wrapped it in a splint. I tried to imagine explaining this at work, or to anyone really. "How did you break your finger?" "Oh, meatball-related mortgage dispute." When we got home later that night, the house was quiet, the smell of dinner still lingering in the air. The dishes had been cleared, the grandkids tucked into bed, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Mike and Jessica were nowhere to be seen. Linda guided me to the couch, tucked a pillow under my arm, and kissed my forehead like I was the one of the kids again. The throbbing in my hand had dulled, replaced by a strange mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Somewhere between laughter and regret, I found myself wondering if I'd done the right thing. Maybe I should have just signed the darn paper, just to keep the peace, just to avoid this whole circus. But deep down, even as I stared at my bandaged hand, I knew that wasn't really the lesson here. Not yet anyway, because this story was far from over. The next morning, I woke up to the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. The house was still, sunlight slipping through the curtains in soft, dusty streaks. My hand throbbed under the bandage, swollen and sore, each pulse reminding me of the chaos from the night before. I sat up slowly, staring at my hand, still half convinced it was all some ridiculous dream. But there it was, wrapped in white gauze, stiff and aching, a painful souvenir from a family dinner gone wrong. Linda had already left for work, her usual note sitting on the kitchen table in her neat, looping handwriting. "Coffee's ready. Don't do anything stupid. Rest that hand." Even now, she managed to sound loving and bossy in the same breath. I smiled faintly, poured myself a cup, and sank into the chair. The quiet gave me too much time to think. I kept replaying the night over and over in my head. Mike's face, shock, guilt, anger, all swirling together. Jessica's disappointment, that cold silence that said more than words ever could. I knew they hadn't meant for things to go that far, but the damage wasn't just physical. Something in our relationship had cracked too. That's the thing about family. When love turns into expectation, and expectation turns into pressure, it can twist everything. I'd spent decades building stability for them, working overtime, sacrificing, saying yes more times than I should have. But lately, it felt like every yes just opened the door for another demand. Maybe this broken finger was a brutal reminder that sometimes you have to draw a line, even with the people you love most. After breakfast, I decided I needed to get out of the house, clear my head. The doctor had prescribed rest, but my thoughts were too restless for that. I slipped on a jacket, grabbed my wallet, and headed for the bank. Not because I planned to change my mind, but because I needed to check something. Something that had been bothering me for months. Ever since Mike had started his new business venture, money had been a recurring topic at the dinner table. He always made it sound like he was just one step away from a breakthrough, just needed a little help to get there. I'd lent him money before, small amounts at first, then bigger ones, always with the promise that he'd pay me back soon. But soon never came, and now after the loan request and the argument, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something wasn't right. The drive to the bank was quiet. The streets were calm, the sky pale and empty. I remember gripping the steering wheel with my good hand, the other one resting awkwardly in my lap, and feeling this strange mix of dread and determination. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're about to find something you don't want to see. The bank was nearly empty when I walked in. A young teller smiled politely, asked how she could help, and I gave her my name and ID. "I just need to review some recent transactions," I said. She nodded and tapped away at her keyboard, the clack of the keys echoing in the quiet room. I waited, watching the clock tick above her desk, every second stretching longer than it should. When she finally handed me the printed statement, my stomach sank before I even looked. A thick stack of pages, more than there should have been. I sat down at the small desk by the window and started scanning the numbers. At first, everything looked normal. Utility payments, grocery store runs, Linda's favorite bakery. Then I saw it, a withdrawal I didn't recognize. Then another, and another. Thousands of dollars pulled out over the past 6 months, all from my joint savings account. I flipped through the pages, my chest tightening. The dates lined up almost perfectly with the times Mike had asked for a little help. Only these weren't transfers to him. These were withdrawals in person, signed under my name. My own signature, replicated perfectly. Too perfectly. I sat there frozen, the paper trembling in my hand. For a moment I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe I'd withdrawn that money myself for some reason. But no, I knew my handwriting, my habits. This wasn't me. My heart started pounding. I turned the pages again, tracing the lines, searching for some explanation that didn't point where I feared it would. Then I noticed one transaction in particular, a large cashier's check made out to a real estate agency. The same one from the brochure Jessica had shown me. My stomach dropped. I could almost hear her voice again, bright and confident, saying, "We just need your signature." Only now I realized maybe they hadn't needed it after all. I asked to see the security footage from one of the withdrawal dates, claiming there'd been a possible mistake. The manager hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. We went into a small back office, the walls lined with filing cabinets and monitors. He played the footage, and there it was, my son, standing at the teller's window, my checkbook in hand, signing my name with practiced ease, smiling, joking with the clerk like it was just another ordinary day. My chest tightened. I felt cold all over. There's a unique kind of pain that comes when betrayal wears the face of your own child. The manager looked at me cautiously. "Do you want us to file a report?" he asked gently. I couldn't answer right away. My mouth was dry, my voice caught somewhere between disbelief and heartbreak. "Not yet," I finally managed to say. "Just print everything you have. I need to think." He nodded and handed me the files. I walked out of that bank with a folder under my arm and a storm inside me. The autumn air felt different now, sharper, crueler. Driving home, I couldn't stop seeing that image in my head, Mike's face on that screen, calm, confident, unbothered. I remembered teaching him how to write his name when he was 6, guiding his small hand over the paper, proud of how quickly he learned. And now, that same signature had become a weapon. I didn't know whether to feel angry or heartbroken. Maybe both, maybe neither. I pulled into the driveway and just sat there for a long time, staring at the house that had once been our safe place. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of last night's dinner. The brochures were gone from the table, replaced by a vase of fresh flowers, Linda's silent attempt to restore normalcy. But normal didn't live here anymore. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the table. Every line was proof. Every number, every date, a piece of the puzzle I never wanted to solve. I tried to imagine what had gone through his mind. Did he think I wouldn't notice? Did he think I'd just forgive and move on? Or had he convinced himself that he was entitled to it? That after all I'd done, it was his turn? The anger came in waves, each one stronger than the last. I slammed my good hand on the table, the sound echoing through the kitchen. For a moment I wanted to call him right then and there, demand an explanation, demand the truth. But something in me stopped. A part of me needed to see how far he'd go on his own, how deep the lie ran. Maybe I wanted to give him one last chance to tell me himself. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to face it yet. I made a pot of coffee, sat back down, and stared at the folder again. The papers looked harmless, just ink on paper. But they carried the weight of everything I'd built, everything I'd trusted. The thought that my own son had taken from me, had used my name to do it, made my chest ache in a way that no broken bone ever could. I thought about calling Linda, but what would I even say? Remember when our son broke my finger? Well, turns out he broke something else too. I didn't have the heart to put that pain into words, not yet. So I sat there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by proof of betrayal, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, wondering how you even begin to forgive something like that, or if you ever really can. That night I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my bandaged hand resting on my chest, my mind replaying everything in slow motion. Every sound in the house felt louder, the ticking clock, the creak of the floorboards, even the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I kept wondering where I had gone wrong as a father, what moment I had missed that turned my son into someone who could look me in the eye, call me dad, and then forge my name at the bank. You raise a child thinking your love will be enough to keep them honest, thinking the lessons you teach will stick. But life has a cruel way of showing you that sometimes love and lessons aren't enough. Somewhere between trying to give him everything and protecting him from failure, I might have made him believe he was entitled to more than he earned. That thought gnawed at me all night. When dawn broke, I went outside. The sky was pale and still, the kind of quiet morning that usually calmed me. But today it felt hollow. I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the street slowly wake up, cars starting, neighbors heading to work, the world moving on like nothing had happened. But everything inside me felt stuck. I could feel the anger simmering, not the loud kind that shouts and breaks things, but the quiet kind that burns from the inside. I wanted to believe there was a good explanation, that maybe Mike had gotten desperate, maybe he'd planned to tell me eventually. But the part of me that had seen the footage, the signature, the calculated confidence in his movements, knew better. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. By mid-morning, Linda called from work to check on me. I tried to sound normal, tried to keep my voice steady. "How's the hand?" she asked. "Sore," I said, "but I'll live." She laughed softly, not sensing the weight behind my words. I almost told her then, almost spilled everything, but something held me back. Maybe I didn't want to see the look in her eyes when she realized what Mike had done. Maybe I needed a little more time to understand what I was going to do about it. Because once the truth came out, there'd be no going back. Later that afternoon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I peeked through the window and saw Mike's truck. My stomach tightened. Part of me wanted to lock the door and pretend I wasn't home, but I knew that wouldn't fix anything. So I opened the door before he could even knock. He looked nervous, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes darting from my hand to my face. "Hey, Dad," he said softly. "How's the finger?" I just stared at him for a moment, taking in his familiar face. The same face I'd watched grow up, the same voice that once called me hero when he was little. It was surreal, seeing him standing there like nothing had happened. "It hurts," I said flatly, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the kitchen, glancing around like he wasn't sure he was welcome. "Mom said you were mad," he muttered, trying to keep things light. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for the folder on the table and slid it toward him. "You want to tell me about this?" I asked. His brow furrowed as he looked down at the papers. The color drained from his face as he flipped through the pages. For a moment he said nothing, just stood there frozen, caught between denial and guilt. Where did you get this? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. From the bank, I said. Where else would I get proof of my own signature being forged? The room went silent. You could hear the clock ticking again, that same relentless sound marking every second of his hesitation. He tried to speak, stopped, rubbed the back of his neck like he used to do as a teenager when he got caught lying. Dad, I can explain, he said finally, but the words sounded empty. I leaned forward, fixing my eyes on him. Then explain, I said. He took a deep breath. I was going to tell you, he started. Things got out of hand. The business hasn't been doing well. I didn't want you to worry, and Jessica kept talking about the house. And I thought if we could just close the deal, things would turn around. His words spilled out fast. Desperate, full of excuses that tried to sound like reasons. You don't understand, Dad. I was going to pay it back. Every cent. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But all I could think about was the image of him at the teller's window, signing my name like it meant nothing. You stole from me, Mike, I said quietly. You forged my signature. That's not something you accidentally do. He looked up, eyes glassy, lips trembling. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he said. I needed help. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the anger rise like a tide. You think this is help? I snapped. Stealing, lying. You had every chance to come to me, to talk to me, but instead, you went behind my back. My voice cracked at the end, not from rage, but from the ache of disappointment. I trusted you, Mike. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. No, don't, don't. He dropped his gaze to the floor, shoulders slumped, the weight of shame settling in. I'll fix it, he murmured. I'll go to the bank, You'll do nothing, I cut in. You've done enough. The words came out colder than I intended, but I meant everyone. I turned away, staring out the window, unable to look at him. For years, I'd thought the hardest part of being a father was saying no. But it wasn't. The hardest part was realizing that sometimes love doesn't protect your child from becoming someone you don't recognize. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Finally, he whispered, I didn't think you'd forgive me if I told you. That line hit me harder than anything else. Because deep down, I realized he might have been right. I didn't know if forgiveness was even possible for something like this. But I also knew that holding on to anger would destroy me too. So I just said, You're right about that. He nodded slowly, eyes red, and without another word, he walked out the door. I watched him go, the sound of his truck fading down the street, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier than before. When Linda came home later, I told her everything. She didn't say much, just sat down beside me, took my good hand in hers, and cried quietly. We didn't talk for a long time after that. The house felt smaller somehow, emptier. Over the next few days, I went through the motions. Doctor visits, paperwork, phone calls. But my mind was somewhere else. Every time the phone rang, I wondered if it was Mike. But it wasn't. The silence stretched on. I'd see his name flash across the TV when his business ran ads, and it felt like seeing a stranger. I thought about calling him, about trying to mend things, but then I'd look at the bank statements again and remember how easily he'd written my name like it belonged to him. The days blurred together. I'd wake up, make coffee, sit in the same chair by the window, and think about the thin line between love and betrayal. You never really understand how fragile trust is until it's broken by someone you'd have died to protect. I'd catch myself wondering if he was okay, if he felt any guilt, if he regretted what he'd done. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But one thing was certain, something between us had changed forever. And no matter how much I wished I could turn back time to that dinner table before everything went wrong, life doesn't give you those chances. It just keeps moving forward, carrying the weight of what's been done, leaving you to figure out how to live with what's left. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a strange kind of quiet. The kind that doesn't bring peace, just absence. The absence of phone calls from Mike. The absence of laughter during Sunday dinners. The absence of the old, easy rhythm that used to define our family. Linda tried to fill the silence with small talk, gardening, extra baking, but I could see the way her eyes drifted to the window every time a car passed by, half hoping it was him. I knew that feeling because I felt it too, even if I didn't admit it. Every night, I'd find myself looking through the folder again, the bank statements, the signatures, the proof of what he'd done, as if staring at them long enough would make it make sense. It never did. There's something strange about betrayal from family. It doesn't just wound you, it rewrites your memories. Every happy moment starts to feel suspicious. Every kind word echoes differently. I'd think back to times Mike had stopped by unannounced, brought me coffee, offered to help with errands. I used to think it was kindness. Now I wondered if he had been testing how much I'd notice, how far he could go without getting caught. Those thoughts kept me up at night, feeding on the small cracks in my trust until they felt like canyons. One morning, about 3 weeks after the confrontation, I got a call from the bank manager. He said there had been new activity, an attempt to access the same account. My chest tightened instantly. "Did you stop it?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "but you might want to come in." That drive to the bank felt heavier than the last one. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, just breathing. The same building that used to represent stability now felt like the place where everything had fallen apart. When I walked inside, the manager handed me another set of documents and a small USB stick. "You should see this," he said. He led me to the back office again and pulled up new footage. My stomach turned as the screen flickered to life. It wasn't Mike this time. It was Jessica. She was standing at the counter, holding a checkbook, my checkbook, flipping through it nervously. Her face was tense, her movements jittery. The teller must have asked her something because she smiled awkwardly and pointed toward the signature line. I could see the hesitation, the guilt, before she turned and walked out, leaving the paper unsigned. It was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. She hadn't just known about what Mike had done, she had been part of it. I left the bank in a daze. The air outside felt colder, sharper. My hand throbbed in its brace, but the real pain sat deeper. Betrayal is one thing, but when it spreads, when it's not just one person but two, working together, it feels like your whole foundation cracks. I drove home in silence, the world passing by like a blur. When I pulled into the driveway, Linda was outside trimming the roses. She looked up, smiled faintly, then froze when she saw my face. "What happened?" she asked. I couldn't answer right away. I just handed her the folder. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where it all began. The same light spilling through the window, the same chairs, the same sense that the world had shifted in some invisible but irreversible way. Linda flipped through the papers, her expression hardening with each page. "She was with him?" she whispered. I nodded. Her hands shook as she closed the folder. "All this time," she said, voice breaking. "They sat here. They ate our food. They smiled at us. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator again, the same sound that had been filling the silences ever since that night. For the first time in my life, I felt old. Not because of my body, not because of the broken finger that was still healing awkwardly, but because of the weight of disillusionment. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes when you realize you've run out of explanations, when you stop trying to understand and just sit with the truth. That night I walked into Mike's old room. It hadn't changed much. Trophies from his school days, a few books, an old poster peeling from the wall. I sat on the edge of his bed and tried to remember him as he was before life got complicated, before ambition turned into desperation. A boy with too much energy, too many dreams, and a heart that I thought was pure. I found myself talking to the empty room, saying things I couldn't say to him face to face. "You could have come to me," I said quietly. "You didn't have to do it like this." My voice cracked, and I had to stop. The house was too quiet, too still, and every sound of the wind outside felt like a reminder of what had been lost. A few days later, Linda got a call from Jessica. I could tell from her expression who it was before she said a word. She hesitated, then put the phone on speaker. Jessica's voice was trembling. "We're sorry," she said. "We made mistakes. We didn't mean for it to go that far." Linda sat there in silence, staring at the phone like it might bite. "You forged his signature," she finally said, her voice shaking. "You stole from your family. Do you even hear yourself?" Jessica started to cry. "We were desperate," Mike thought. He thought he could fix it before anyone found out. "Please, just tell him not to go to the police." That last sentence hung in the air like smoke. When the call ended, Linda turned to me. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. I'd been thinking about it for days. Filing a report would be justice, maybe even closure. But it would also destroy whatever fragile chance of reconciliation might still exist. I wasn't sure which hurt worse, the betrayal itself or the thought of losing my son completely. That night, I drove to their house. The same house from the brochures, the one that had started it all. It wasn't finished yet. Construction equipment still sat in the yard. The lights were on inside. I sat in the car for a long time before knocking on the door. Mike opened it, surprise flickering across his face. "Dad?" he said, stepping aside. Jessica was sitting on the couch, her eyes red. The air inside felt thick with tension. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just looked at them both and said, "You have 1 week to make it right." Mike swallowed hard. "How?" he asked. "Start by repaying what you took," I said. "Sell the car, the furniture, whatever you have to. You're adults. You made choices. Now fix them." Jessica started crying again, but I didn't flinch. "And after that," I continued, "I want you both to leave town for a while. Figure out who you are without dragging anyone else down with you." Mike looked like he wanted to argue, but then he saw something in my face that made him stop. Maybe it was the finality in my tone. Maybe it was the disappointment he couldn't escape anymore. He just nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, Dad." I turned and walked out without looking back. When I got home, Linda was waiting by the window. "Well?" she asked. "They'll fix it," I said simply. She didn't press for details. We just stood there together, two parents trying to hold on to the fragments of what was left. Over the next week, the payments started trickling in. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Each deposit felt like both a relief and a reminder. By the end of it, most of the missing money was returned. No apology could undo the damage, but the act itself meant something. It meant maybe they understood. Maybe they were trying to make it right. Still, even with the money back in the account, nothing felt whole again. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal like a bone. It doesn't set cleanly. It leaves scars that remind you where it fractured. Every time I saw their names pop up on my phone, every time Linda mentioned them, that ache returned. But there was also something else growing beneath it. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. A quiet understanding that sometimes love doesn't mean forgetting what someone did. It means seeing them clearly, flaws and all, and deciding whether you can still love them anyway. The days went on, slow and steady, the way life always does after chaos. I kept the folder tucked away in a drawer, not because I needed it anymore, but because it had become part of the story, a reminder of how quickly trust can be tested, and how even when it breaks, the pieces still matter. I didn't know what would happen next, whether Mike and I would ever truly mend what had been shattered. But I knew one thing for certain: the next time I signed my name on anything, I'd make sure I was the only one holding the pen. Weeks had passed since that chaotic dinner night, and the pain in my finger had mostly faded, though every now and then I could still feel a dull ache reminding me of what happened. But more than the physical pain, there was something deeper that had shifted in the family dynamic. We were no longer walking on eggshells or trying to pretend that everything was fine. The air in the house felt lighter, like a storm had passed and left the sky clearer than before. Mike came over every few days, not to ask for help or money, but just to talk. Sometimes he'd bring coffee, other times he'd just sit in silence for a while before opening up. I could tell he was changing, learning in ways that words couldn't quite capture. Jessica, too, had softened. Her sharp edges seemed to dull with humility. She started spending more time with my wife, asking about cooking, budgeting, and even gardening. There was something beautiful about watching her trade her Pinterest dreams for the quiet wisdom of practicality. One afternoon, I found Mike in the garage, sorting through old tools. He looked up when I came in and smiled awkwardly, like a kid caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. He said he wanted to start fixing up the old shed in their backyard, make it into a workspace for Jessica's crafts. It wasn't the big house they once dreamed of, but it was something real, something they could build with their own hands. I stood there watching him plan it out, and it struck me that this simple, honest work was the foundation of something far stronger than any loan-backed mansion. He was learning that pride doesn't come from the price tag of a house, but from the effort it takes to make it a home. Jessica joined him later, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. The two of them were covered in sawdust and laughter, It was messy, imperfect, but genuine. They worked side by side, arguing playfully about measurements and colors. I sat on a nearby chair, pretending to supervise, but really, I was just taking it all in. Watching them rebuild, not just the shed, but themselves, felt like witnessing a quiet miracle. Sometimes growth isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's hidden in the sound of a hammer tapping against wood, or the way two people learn to speak gently to each other again after shouting for too long. Every Friday evening, they'd come over for dinner. It became a new family ritual. The table was simpler now, the meals humbler, but the laughter louder. My wife started calling those nights Healing Fridays. We talk about our weeks, our plans, and our mistakes. No judgment, no tension, just honesty. Mike confessed that he'd started reading about personal finance, trying to understand what went wrong. Jessica admitted that she had felt pressured by social media, always comparing her life to others. It was as if that one fight, that one broken finger, had cracked open something inside all of us that needed to breathe. One night, Mike brought over a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a check. Not a large one, but it was money he had saved by cutting back on unnecessary expenses. He said it was repayment for the hospital bill from that night. I laughed and told him it wasn't necessary, but he insisted. It wasn't about the money, he said. It was about accountability, about learning to stand on his own 2 feet. I could see the pride in his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from having it all, but from earning every inch of progress. As months passed, their shed project turned into something beautiful. Jessica started selling her crafts online, and people loved them. Orders began to pour in, and before long, they had a small side business running from that very shed. It was humble, but it gave them purpose. Mike took on extra work, managing his time better, saving rather than spending. They talked about the future, but this time it wasn't about dream houses or luxury cars. It was about sustainability, peace of mind, and raising their children with values that couldn't be bought one weekend. They invited us over to see the finished shed. It was painted a soft yellow, with flowers planted neatly along the side. Inside, shelves were lined with Jessica's handmade candles and crafts. There was even a small sign above the door that read, "Built with love and lessons." I stood there speechless for a moment, realizing how far they'd come. This wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of growth, forgiveness, and resilience. Jessica handed me a candle she'd made herself, the scent a mix of pine and vanilla. She smiled shyly and said, "For patience and new beginnings." I didn't need to say anything. My eyes did all the talking by Christmas. That broken finger story had turned into a family legend. Everyone knew the tale of the Great Meatball Incident. My grandkids would burst into laughter every time the story was told, reenacting the chaos of that night with exaggerated gestures. Even Jessica, who once cringed at the memory, now laughed the loudest. The story no longer carried pain, it carried perspective. It became our reminder that sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most meaningful ones. That broken finger had healed, but what it represented, the breaking of pride, the mending of understanding, was something far deeper. Life settled into a rhythm. The drama had passed, replaced by a kind of peace that only comes after a storm. I'd sit on the porch some evenings, watching the sun dip low and thinking about how easily love can turn into conflict when pride takes the wheel. I thought about how close we'd come to losing each other over something as simple as a signature. But then again, maybe that's how life teaches its hardest lessons, by letting you stumble so you can learn how to stand stronger. The bank meeting, the argument, the injury, all of it was part of a greater plan to teach us what really matters. Mike had started mentoring some of his younger coworkers about money management. Jessica volunteered at the local community center, teaching budgeting workshops to young couples. The very thing that once caused them pain had become their message to others. They'd learned not to chase appearances, but to build foundations that last. Sometimes they'd joke about writing a book called The Broken Finger Budget Guide. It was funny, but there was truth in it. The incident that once embarrassed them now inspired them. Even our neighbors noticed the change. People would comment on how much calmer, happier, and closer our family seemed. I'd just smile and tell them that peace doesn't come easy. It's something you build, one small act at a time. Every shared meal, every open conversation, every laugh after a storm, all of it adds up. The home may not be big or fancy, but it's filled with something far more valuable: mutual respect and understanding. In the end, that's what family is about, not avoiding conflict, but growing from it. When I looked around the dinner table on those quiet evenings, I saw not just faces, but journeys. Jessica's humility, Mike's maturity, my wife's endless patience, it all wove together like a tapestry of hard-earned grace. We'd been tested, bruised, and broken, but we came out stronger, more grounded, and more grateful. The chaos that once divided us had become the glue that held us tighter. Every scar, every laugh, every shared glance told the story of a family that had learned to build not just walls or roofs, but bridges that could withstand any storm.